Orphaned kitten cries for help. What happens when someone answers will stun you. How will this story unfold? To find out, watch the video to the end. But first, please subscribe to my channel and turn on notifications to get more stories like this. The world felt impossibly large to the tiny kitten, a speck of life surrounded by an endless sea of towering trees and shadowed undergrowth. The forest floor was damp and cool, littered with leaves that rustled softly with every faint breeze. Somewhere far off, birds sang their morning songs, their melodies light and carefree, but to the kitten, the sounds were distant, as though part of another world. It sat shivering on a patch of moss, its little body no bigger than a handful of fur and bones. Its coat, once soft and pristine, was now matted and streaked with dirt. Its eyes, wide and glassy, held a mix of fear and exhaustion, flicking nervously at every sound that broke through the quiet. It didn't belong here. Everything about the forest felt wrong, cold, unwelcoming, and too vast for something as small and fragile as it was. The kitten let out a faint, high-pitched cry, its tiny voice breaking through the stillness like the softest plea. Meow? It didn't know what it was calling for, only that its instincts told it to cry out, to keep crying, because surely someone would come. Its mother had always come before, her warm fur, her soothing purrs, her milk that filled its belly and chased away the ache of hunger. But its mother wasn't here now. The kitten cried again, louder this time, the sound tinged with desperation. Its tiny voice echoed weakly through the forest, bouncing off the trees and disappearing into the endless green. There was no reply. It tried to stand, its legs trembling beneath its weight. Every muscle in its body ached, and its little paws were raw from wandering aimlessly over rough terrain. It didn't know where it was going or where it had come from, only that it was alone. The kitten stumbled forward, its paws sinking into the soft moss. It let out another pitiful cry, its voice breaking with exhaustion. Meow. But again, there was no answer. The kitten's strength gave out, and it collapsed onto the ground, its tiny chest heaving as it struggled to breathe. The ache in its belly was sharp now, a gnawing hunger that felt like it would never end. Its vision blurred, the world around it fading into a haze of green and brown. And then, through the fog of its exhaustion, it heard something. A sound, faint at first but growing louder. Footsteps. The steady crunch of leaves underfoot. The kitten's ears perked up, its tiny body tensing as hope flared in its chest. It lifted its head weakly, its wide eyes scanning the trees for the source of the sound. Hello. A voice called out, soft and uncertain. It was a human voice, deep and gentle, carrying with it a warmth that the kitten hadn't felt in days. The footsteps grew closer, and then through the trees, a figure appeared. It was a man, his tall frame silhouetted against the dappled sunlight filtering through the canopy. He wore a worn jacket, and his boots were caked with mud, as though he had been walking for hours. His face was kind, framed by a rough beard that did little to hide the concern in his eyes as he scanned the forest. The kitten let out a faint cry, its voice trembling with both fear and hope. Meow. The man froze, his eyes snapping to the tiny bundle of fur lying motionless on the moss. Oh no, he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. He stepped closer, moving carefully so as not to startle the tiny creature. Hey there, little one. What you doing all the way out here? The kitten watched him warily, its body trembling as he knelt down in front of it. His hands were rough and calloused, but when he reached out, his touch was impossibly gentle. He scooped the kitten up carefully, cradling it in his palms as though it were made of glass. You're all alone, aren't you? He said softly, his eyes scanning the kitten's tiny body. He could feel how thin it was, its ribs pressing against its skin, its fur tangled and damp. Where's your mama? The kitten didn't answer, of course, but it let out another faint cry, its tiny head tilting as it looked up at him. Its yellow eyes were wide and filled with something that made the man's chest tighten. Fear, yes, but also a desperate kind of trust. It's okay, he murmured, holding the kitten close to his chest. I've got you now. You're safe. The kitten let out a soft meow, its tiny body trembling as it leaned into the warmth of his hand. It didn't understand who this man was or why he had picked it up, but for the first time in what felt like forever, it didn't feel so alone. The man glanced around the forest, his brow furrowing as he tried to make sense of the situation. How did you end up out here, little one? He muttered. No sign of your mother, no other tracks. He sighed, cradling the kitten closer as he stood. All right, he said softly. Let's get you out of here. The walk back to the man's truck was slow and careful. He held the kitten close to his chest, shielding it from the cool breeze that swept through the forest. The kitten stayed still in his hands, its tiny body too weak to do anything but cling to the warmth of his jacket. The truck was parked on the edge of a narrow dirt road, its battered frame a testament to years of hard use. The man opened the door carefully, sliding into the driver's seat with the kitten still cradled in his hand. He placed it gently on the passenger seat, wrapping it in a soft towel he had found behind the seat. "There we go," he said softly, tucking the edges of the towel around the kitten's tiny body. "Nice and warm." The kitten let out a faint meow, its yellow eyes fluttering closed as the warmth of the towel seeped into its fur. It felt safe now, cocooned in the soft fabric with the man's presence nearby. The man started the truck, the engine rumbling to life with a low growl. "Let's get you some food," he said, glancing over at the kitten. "You're gonna be okay, little one. I promise." The drive into town was quiet, the kitten sleeping soundly in its makeshift nest. The man glanced over at it occasionally, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. He couldn't explain why, but something about the tiny creature had struck a chord in him. It was so small, so helpless, and yet it had survived against all odds. When they reached the town, the man pulled into the parking lot of a small pet supply store. He carried the kitten inside, the towel still wrapped snugly around it, and quickly gathered everything he would need: milk replacer, a tiny bottle, and a soft blanket for the kitten to sleep on. The cashier, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, smiled as she rang up his purchases. "Found yourself a little friend, huh?" she said, glancing down at the kitten. "Yeah," the man said softly, his eyes on the tiny creature in his hands. "Found her out in the woods. She was all alone." The woman's smile softened. "Well, she's lucky you found her," she said. "Not many would have stopped." The man nodded, his grip on the towel tightening slightly. "Yeah," he said quietly. "She's lucky." But as he carried the kitten back to the truck, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was the lucky one. The kitten stirred as they pulled into the man's driveway, its tiny body shifting beneath the towel. The man smiled as he lifted it carefully, cradling it in his hands as he stepped out of the truck. "Welcome home, little one," he said softly, his voice warm and steady. The house was small and modest, nestled at the edge of a quiet street. Inside, it was cozy and inviting, with soft, warm lighting and the faint scent of wood smoke lingering in the air. The man set the kitten down gently on the couch, unwrapping the towel and placing it on a plush blanket he had laid out. "There you go," he murmured, brushing a finger lightly over the kitten's head. "Nice and comfortable." The kitten let out a soft meow, its tiny body curling up on the blanket. For the first time in days, it felt warm, safe, and cared for. The man watched it for a moment, his chest tightening as he realized just how small and fragile it was. "You're a fighter, aren't you?" he said softly. "Don't worry. You're not alone anymore." The kitten let out another soft meow, its yellow eyes fluttering closed as sleep pulled it under. And as the man sat beside it, a quiet warmth settled over the room, a warmth that neither of them had felt in a long time. The kitten stirred in its sleep, its tiny paws twitching against the soft blanket. Its chest rose and fell with steady breaths, the faintest purr rumbling from deep within its fragile body. The man sat nearby, his rough hands resting on his knees as he watched over it. He hadn't meant to get so attached so quickly, but there was something about the kitten, its resilience, its vulnerability, that struck a chord in him. He leaned back against the couch, his gaze drifting to the small bottle of milk replacer and the tiny feeding bottle he'd set on the coffee table. It had been years since he'd taken care of anything other than himself, and yet, as he prepared to care for this little creature, it felt as though he was stepping into a role he hadn't realized he needed. The kitten stirred again, letting out a faint mewl as its eyes fluttered open. The man leaned forward, his movements slow and deliberate so as not to startle it. "Hey there, little one," he murmured, his voice low and soothing. "Did you have a good nap?" The kitten blinked up at him, its wide yellow eyes filled with curiosity and a hint of trust. It let out another soft meow, its tiny body trembling slightly as it tried to sit up. The man smiled, reaching out to brush a gentle finger over the kitten's head. "You've been through a lot, huh?" he said softly. "Let's get you some food." He picked up the small feeding bottle, carefully filling it with a milk replacer. The kitten's nose twitched as the faint scent of the warm liquid filled the air, and it let out a high-pitched chirp, its tiny paws reaching out instinctively. The man chuckled, his heart aching at the sight of the kitten's eagerness. All right," he said, lifting the bottle to its tiny mouth. "Here you go." The kitten latched onto the bottle, its tiny tongue working furiously as it drank. Its eyes fluttered closed, and for the first time in what felt like forever, it felt warmth and fullness spreading through its tiny body. The man watched in silence, his chest tightening as he realized just how fragile this little life was, and just how much he wanted to protect it. When the kitten had finished, it let out a soft sigh, its tiny body relaxing against the blanket. The man set the bottle aside, gently wiping its mouth with a cloth. "There we go," he murmured. "All better." The kitten let out a faint purr, its yellow eyes blinking up at him with a look of pure contentment. The man couldn't help but smile, his rough exterior softening as he ran a finger lightly over its tiny head. "You're something special, aren't you?" he said softly. "I think I'll call you Lucky." The kitten chirped softly in response, as though agreeing with the name. The days that followed were a whirlwind of adjustments and small victories. The man quickly fell into a routine, his life revolving around the tiny kitten that had so unexpectedly entered his world. He fed it every few hours, warmed it with soft blankets, and even carried it around the house in the pocket of his jacket when it seemed too weak to be left alone. Lucky, as he had named her, began to grow stronger with each passing day. Her tiny body filled out, her fur grew softer, and her eyes sparkled with a curiosity that was both endearing and mischievous. She explored every corner of the small house, her tiny paws patting across the wooden floors as she discovered her new home. The man found himself laughing more than he had in years. Lucky's antics, chasing after a loose thread, pouncing on a dust bunny, or curling up on his work boots, brought a warmth to his heart that he hadn't realized he'd been missing. At night, Lucky would curl up on his chest, her tiny purrs lulling him to sleep. He would rest a hand over her small body, her warmth and steady breaths grounding him in a way that nothing else ever had. But while life inside the house had become a source of joy, the world outside was far less forgiving. One crisp morning, as the man prepared to step out for groceries, Lucky padded to the door, her tiny paws clicking softly against the floor. She sat at his feet, her wide eyes gazing up at him with a mixture of curiosity and concern. "You can't come with me, little one," he said softly, crouching down to scratch behind her ears. "It's too dangerous out there." Lucky let out a plaintive meow, her tiny body pressing against his leg as though trying to follow him. The man sighed, his heart aching at the sight of her sadness. "I won't be gone long," he promised. "You'll be safe here. I'll make sure of it." He picked her up gently, placing her in a cozy bed by the fireplace. She chirped softly, her yellow eyes watching him intently as he stepped toward the door. But as he turned the knob, a faint sound reached his ears, a sound that sent a chill down his spine. It was a yowl, sharp and guttural, echoing from somewhere outside. The man froze, his hand tightening on the doorknob. He turned slowly, his eyes meeting Lucky's wide, frightened gaze. The yowl came again, louder this time, followed by the unmistakable sound of claws scraping against wood. The man's heart raced as he moved to the window, pulling back the curtain just enough to peer outside. What he saw made his blood run cold. A large, feral cat stood at the edge of the yard, its matted fur bristling as it paced back and forth. Its eyes glinted with a wild, predatory light, and its sharp claws tore into the earth as it let out another piercing yowl. The man turned back to Lucky, who had curled into a tight ball, her tiny body trembling with fear. "It's okay," he said softly, crossing the room to scoop her up. "I've got you. Nothing's going to hurt you." He held her close, her tiny purrs vibrating against his chest as he moved to the door. He stepped outside cautiously, his eyes scanning the yard for any sign of danger. The feral cat was still there, its piercing gaze locking onto him as he approached. It let out a low growl, its body tensing as though ready to pounce. The man stood his ground, his grip on Lucky tightening as he spoke in a firm, steady voice. "You're not welcome here," he said, his tone low and commanding. "This isn't your territory." The cat hissed, its sharp teeth bared as it took a step forward. The man didn't flinch. He held his ground, his eyes never leaving the feral cat's. After what felt like an eternity, the cat let out a final yowl before turning and slinking back into the woods. The man let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, his shoulders relaxing as the tension drained from his body. He looked down at Lucky, who was still trembling in his arms. "It's okay," he murmured, stroking her soft fur. "It's gone now. You're safe." Lucky let out a soft chirp, her tiny paws pressing against his chest as she nuzzled into his jacket. The man smiled, his heart swelling with a fierce, protective love. "I'll always keep you safe," he said softly, "no matter what." Over the weeks that followed, Lucky grew stronger and more confident, her tiny frame filling out with the love and care she had found in her new home. She explored the house with fearless curiosity, her tiny paws leaving trails of mischief wherever she went. And though the man had once lived a quiet, solitary life, he now found himself laughing more than ever. Lucky had brought a light into his world, a joy that he hadn't realized he was missing. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the house in a warm, golden glow, the man sat on the couch with Lucky curled up in his lap. Her tiny purrs filled the room, a sound that had become the heartbeat of his days. He ran a hand gently over her soft fur, his eyes softening as he looked down at her. "You've changed everything, little one," he said softly. "I don't know what I'd do without you." Lucky let out a soft meow, her tiny body pressing closer to his. And in that moment, surrounded by the warmth of their shared bond, the man realized something profound. Sometimes, the smallest creatures can leave the biggest impact on our hearts. The days stretched into weeks, and Lucky became a vibrant presence in the man's life. The once fragile kitten who had trembled in fear on the forest floor was now bounding across the house with endless energy. She'd dart after loose threads, pounce on imaginary prey, and make a game out of chasing the sunlight that filtered through the windows. Her transformation was nothing short of miraculous. The man, who had lived quietly and alone for so long, found himself adjusting to this new rhythm of life. Lucky's antics brought laughter back into his days, her tiny purrs filling the quiet moments with warmth. He hadn't realized just how much he'd missed having something or someone to care for. Lucky wasn't just a pet, she was a companion, a spark of life that had reignited something in him he thought was long gone. One chilly morning, as frost clung to the edges of the windows, Lucky sat on the windowsill, her soft fur glowing in the pale light. She watched the world outside with wide, curious eyes, her tiny nose twitching at the faint scent of winter in the air. The man sipped his coffee, watching her from the kitchen with a smile. "You've got the heart of an explorer, don't you?" he said, his voice warm and teasing. "Always looking for an adventure." Lucky turned her head at the sound of his voice, her little tail twitching. She let out a soft meow, her yellow eyes sparkling with mischief. The man chuckled, setting his mug down as he crossed the room to scratch behind her ears. "You're a handful, you know that," he said, "but I wouldn't have it any other way." Lucky purred in response, leaning into his touch. The moment was peaceful, the kind of quiet joy that had become the cornerstone of their days together. But as the man turned to prepare her breakfast, Lucky's ears perked up. She hopped off the windowsill, her tiny paws patting across the floor as she trotted toward the door. "What is it, girl?" the man asked, following her gaze. Lucky meowed insistently, her little body pressed against the door as though trying to push it open. The man frowned, setting the food bowl aside as he walked over. He opened the door cautiously, the cold air rushing in and sending a shiver down his spine. Lucky darted out onto the porch, her tail held high as she sniffed the air. The man followed her, his boots crunching against the frost-covered ground. The morning was still, the world bathed in soft, pale light. But something felt off. Lucky let out a sharp meow, her tiny body tensing as she stared toward the edge of the yard. The man's eyes followed her gaze, and his breath caught in his throat. There, huddled beneath a bush, was another kitten. It was even smaller than Lucky had been when he'd found her, its tiny body trembling against the cold. Its fur was matted and dirty, and its wide eyes were filled with fear. "Oh no," the man murmured, stepping forward cautiously. The kitten let out a faint, pitiful cry, its tiny claws digging into the frozen ground as it tried to back away. The man knelt down, his movements slow and deliberate. "It's okay," he said softly, his voice gentle and steady. "I'm not going to hurt you." Lucky trotted over to the tiny kitten, her body language calm and reassuring. She let out a soft meow, her tone light and friendly, as though trying to comfort the frightened creature. The tiny kitten froze, its wide eyes locked on Lucky. It let out another faint cry, its tiny body trembling as it stared at the pair of them. The man reached out slowly, his hand open and unthreatening. "Come on, little one," he murmured. "Let's get you warmed up." The kitten hesitated for a long moment, its tiny body poised to flee. But then, as though sensing the kindness in his voice, it took a cautious step forward. The man scooped the kitten up carefully, cradling it against his chest as he stood. Its tiny body was ice cold, its thin frame trembling with exhaustion and fear. Lucky meowed softly, trotting alongside him as he carried the kitten back into the house. Inside, the man set the kitten down on a soft blanket near the fireplace. He worked quickly, wrapping it in another blanket to warm it up and preparing a small bowl of milk replacer. Lucky sat nearby, her yellow eyes wide with curiosity as she watched him work. "There you go," the man said softly, holding the bowl close to the tiny kitten. "Drink up. You'll feel better soon." The kitten sniffed the milk cautiously, its tiny nose twitching. Then, with a burst of energy born of desperation, it began to lap at the liquid, its tiny tongue working furiously. Lucky let out a soft chirp, her tail swishing as she watched the kitten eat. The man smiled, his heart swelling with a mix of relief and affection. "You're a good big sister, Lucky," he said, scratching behind her ears. The kitten finished the milk, its tiny body relaxing as the warmth spread through it. It let out a faint purr, its wide eyes blinking up at the man and Lucky with a mixture of gratitude and trust. The man leaned back, his rough hands resting on his knees as he watched the two kittens. His quiet house, once so still and empty, was now filled with life and warmth. He hadn't expected any of this when he found Lucky in the woods, but he couldn't imagine his life any other way. The days turned into weeks, and the new kitten, whom the man had named Shadow, quickly settled into her new home. She was smaller and shyer than Lucky, but her quiet, curious nature complemented Lucky's boundless energy perfectly. The two kittens became inseparable, exploring the house together and curling up in a warm pile at the end of the day. The man found himself smiling more than ever, his heart filled with a joy he hadn't thought possible. The kittens had brought something into his life that he hadn't realized he was missing, a sense of purpose, of connection, of family. One evening, as the sun set behind the trees, painting the house in shades of gold and crimson, the man sat on a couch with Lucky and Shadow curled up beside him. Their tiny purrs filled the room, a sound that felt like the heartbeat of his home. He ran a hand gently over their soft fur, his gaze softening as he looked down at them. "You two have changed everything," he said softly. "I don't know what I'd do without you." Lucky let out a soft meow, her tiny body pressing closer to his side. Shadow chirped faintly, her wide eyes blinking up at him with trust and affection. The man smiled, his chest tightening with a mix of love and gratitude. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain. Sometimes the smallest creatures can make the biggest difference. That night, as the house settled into quiet, the man sat by the fireplace, his thoughts drifting back to the moment he had found Lucky in the woods. She had been so small, so fragile, and yet she had survived against all odds. And now, because of her, Shadow had found her way to safety too. He leaned back in his chair, his gaze flicking to the two kittens curled up together on the blanket. They were a reminder of the resilience of life, of the power of love and care to transform even the direst of circumstances. And as the fire crackled softly in the hearth, filling the room with warmth, the man felt a quiet contentment settle over him, a sense of peace that he hadn't felt in years. In a world that could be so cold and unkind, Lucky and Shadow had shown him the beauty of connection, the strength of compassion, and the profound impact of even the smallest acts of kindness. The house had become a haven not just for Lucky and Shadow, but for the man himself. Days passed in quiet companionship, the kittens filling every corner with their energy and curiosity. Lucky, the older and more confident of the two, often led the way, darting through rooms and pouncing on stray socks as though they were prey. Shadow, quieter and more reserved, watched her antics with wide, curious eyes before tentatively joining in. One afternoon, as sunlight streamed through the windows, Lucky and Shadow discovered a patch of warmth on the living room rug. They sprawled out side by side, their tiny bodies soaking in the light. Lucky's soft purring filled the room, a soothing rhythm that seemed to lull even Shadow into a rare moment of relaxation. The man sat nearby, a book open in his lap but largely ignored as he watched the kittens. A smile tugged at his lips as Shadow, emboldened by Lucky's calm presence, stretched out her tiny paws and let out a faint, contented chirp. "You two sure know how to brighten up a day," he murmured, his voice soft with affection. The kittens didn't respond, of course, but Lucky's tail flicked lazily, as though acknowledging his words. The man set his book aside, leaning back in his chair as his gaze drifted to the window. Outside, the world was shifting, the trees shedding their leaves in vibrant shades of red and gold. It was a season of change, of letting go and starting anew, a fitting backdrop for the transformation his life had undergone since the day he found Lucky. But even as he reveled in the warmth of their shared bond, a faint unease lingered at the edges of his thoughts. The world outside the safety of the house was unpredictable, and the memory of the feral cat's intrusion still haunted him. He couldn't help but worry about what might happen if another threat emerged. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the house in soft, golden light, the man decided it was time to take precautions. He spent the next morning securing the yard, patching up gaps in the fence and removing anything that might attract unwanted visitors. Lucky and Shadow watched him through the window, their tiny faces pressed against the glass as they followed his every move. By the time he finished, the yard felt like a fortress, a safe space where the kittens could explore without fear. He stepped back, wiping sweat from his brow as he glanced toward the window. Lucky let out a chirp of approval, her yellow eyes bright with curiosity. "Just wait," the man said with a grin, opening the door to let the kittens out. "You're going to love this." The first time Lucky and Shadow stepped into the yard, their reactions couldn't have been more different. Lucky darted forward, her tiny paws skimming across the grass as she explored every corner with boundless energy. Shadow, on the other hand, hesitated at the threshold, her wide eyes scanning the unfamiliar space with a mix of curiosity and caution. The man knelt down, extending a hand toward Shadow. "It's okay," he said softly. "You're safe here." Shadow blinked up at him, her tiny nose twitching as she sniffed the air. Slowly, tentatively, she took a step forward, her small paws pressing into the soft grass. "That's it," the man murmured, his voice warm and encouraging. "Take your time." Lucky, meanwhile, had already claimed a patch of sunlight near the fence, her tail flicking lazily as she sprawled out on the grass. She chirped at Shadow, her tone light and inviting, as though urging her to join in the fun. Shadow took another cautious step, then another, until she was fully outside. She sniffed the air again, her wide eyes darting between Lucky and the man as she adjusted to the unfamiliar space. The man watched them both with a quiet sense of pride. It was a small moment, perhaps, but it felt significant, a testament to how far they had come since the days when they had been alone and afraid. As the afternoon wore on, the kittens grew more comfortable in the yard. Lucky chased a butterfly, her tiny body leaping and twisting with a grace that belied her size. Shadow watched from a distance, her gaze thoughtful and observant, before finally joining in. The man sat on the porch, a cup of coffee in his hands as he watched them play. For the first time in years, his heart felt full, his life enriched by the simple joy of their presence. "You two have no idea how much you've changed my life," he said softly, his voice barely audible over the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. But life, as always, had its challenges. One crisp evening, as the man prepared dinner, Lucky and Shadow curled up together in their usual spot by the fireplace. The room was warm and quiet, the kittens purring a gentle backdrop to the soft clatter of pots and pans. The man glanced over his shoulder, a smile tugging at his lips as he watched them. But his moment of contentment was interrupted by a sudden, sharp knock at the door. The kittens jolted awake, their wide eyes darting toward the sound. Lucky let out a low chirp, her tiny body tensing as she pressed closer to Shadow. The man wiped his hands on a towel, his brow furrowing as he moved to the door. It wasn't often that he had visitors, and something about the knock felt off, too forceful, too insistent. He opened the door cautiously, his gaze meeting that of a man he didn't recognize. The stranger was tall and broad-shouldered, his face shadowed by the brim of a worn hat. "Can I help you?" the man asked, his tone guarded. The stranger's eyes flicked past him, scanning the interior of the house. "Heard you've got some cats," he said, his voice low and gravelly. The man's grip on the door tightened. "Why do you ask?" The stranger shrugged, his lips curving into a faint smirk. "Just looking for a few strays. Thought they might have wandered this way." "They're not strays," the man said firmly, his voice steady. "They're mine." The stranger's smirk faltered, his gaze narrowing. "You sure about that?" The man didn't hesitate. "I'm sure." For a long moment, the two men stared each other down, the air between them crackling with tension. Then, without another word, the stranger turned and walked away, his boots crunching against the gravel as he disappeared into the fading light. The man closed the door, his chest tight with a mix of anger and unease. He turned back to the kittens, who were huddled together by the fireplace, their tiny bodies trembling with fear. "It's okay," he murmured, crouching down to scoop them up. "He's gone now. You're safe." But as he held them close, their tiny hearts beating against his chest, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. The man stayed up late that night, his mind restless as he sat by the fireplace with Lucky and Shadow curled up on his lap. The encounter with the stranger had unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. There had been something in the man's tone, in the way his eyes lingered too long, that didn't sit right. Lucky let out a soft chirp, shifting in her sleep as her tiny paws twitched against his leg. Shadow was tucked close to her side, her smaller frame rising and falling with steady breaths. The sight of them together brought a momentary sense of calm, but was fleeting. The man's gaze drifted to the window, his eyes scanning the darkness beyond. The night was still, the faint rustle of leaves the only sound breaking the silence. But the shadows felt deeper tonight, heavier, as though something unseen was lurking just out of reach. He tightened his grip on the kittens, his jaw clenching as a quiet resolve settled over him. He wasn't going to let anything happen to them. Not Lucky, not Shadow. They were his family now, and he would do whatever it took to keep them safe. The next morning, the man set to work reinforcing the house. He checked every window, every door, ensuring that there were no weak points. He installed new locks and even rigged up a small security system with motion-activated lights for the yard. Lucky and Shadow watched him curiously as he worked, their tiny faces peeking out from behind a couch. Lucky let out an occasional chirp, her tail swishing with interest, while Shadow remained quiet, her wide eyes darting between the man and the tools he was using. "You two are my little supervisors, huh?" the man said with a soft chuckle, glancing back at them. "Don't worry, I'll make sure this place is as safe as it can be." By the time he finished, the house felt more secure than ever. The man stood in the middle of the living room, wiping his hands on a rag as he surveyed his work. "That should do it," he murmured, his gaze shifting to the kittens. "No one's getting in here without me knowing." Lucky chirped in response, hopping down from the couch to rub against his leg. Shadow followed cautiously, her smaller frame pressing close to Lucky's side. The man knelt down, scratching behind their ears as a small smile tugged at his lips. "You're safe now," he said softly. "I promise." For a few days, life returned to a semblance of normalcy. The kittens played and explored as usual, their tiny bodies darting through the house with boundless energy. Lucky had discovered a new favorite game, chasing the beam of light from a flashlight, and Shadow had started to come out of her shell, joining Lucky in her antics with hesitant but growing confidence. The man watched them with quiet affection, his heart swelling at the sight of their joy. They were thriving, and it was a reminder of how far they had come since the days when they had been scared and alone. But the unease lingered, a shadow that refused to fade. The man found himself glancing at the windows more often, his ears straining for any unusual sounds. He couldn't shake the feeling that the stranger might return, that the safety he had worked so hard to create could still be threatened. That feeling proved to be more than just paranoia. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the man was sitting on the porch with Lucky and Shadow at his feet. The air was cool and crisp, the faint scent of pine drifting through the breeze. The kittens were chasing leaves that skittered across the ground, their tiny bodies darting back and forth with uncontainable energy. The man smiled, his gaze soft as he watched them play. But then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw something that made his heart drop. A figure was standing at the edge of the yard, just beyond the fence. The man's body tensed, his smile fading as he rose to his feet. He recognized the broad shoulders, the worn hat, the same stranger who had come to his door days ago. The kittens froze, their tiny bodies huddling together as they sensed the shift in the man's demeanor. Lucky let out a faint chirp, her wide eyes darting between the man and the figure in the shadows. The man stepped forward, his voice steady but firm. "What are you doing here?" The stranger didn't move, his face obscured by the brim of his hat. "Just passing through," he said, his tone casual but laced with something darker. "Nice setup you've got here." The man's jaw clenched. "You need to leave," he said, his voice hardening. "No." The stranger tilted his head, his gaze shifting to the kittens. "Cute little things," he said, ignoring the man's words. "Shame if something happened to them." The man's fists tightened at his sides, anger flaring in his chest. "I said leave." For a moment, the stranger didn't move, his silhouette still and unmoving against the fading light. Then, without a word, he turned and walked away, his boots crunching against the gravel as he disappeared into the trees. The man stood there for a long moment, his chest heaving as he struggled to calm his racing heart. He glanced down at the kittens, who were pressed against his legs, their tiny bodies trembling with fear. "It's okay," he murmured, crouching down to scoop them up. "He's gone now. You're safe." But as he held them close, their tiny hearts beating against his chest, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. That night, the man barely slept. He stayed by the window, his eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. Lucky and Shadow were curled up together on the couch, their tiny bodies rising and falling with steady breaths. The house was quiet, the only sound the faint crackle of the fireplace. But the man's mind was anything but calm. He couldn't stop replaying the stranger's words, the way his gaze had lingered on the kittens. The hours dragged on, the darkness outside pressing against the windows like a living thing. The man's grip on the bat he had placed by the door tightened, his muscles coiled and ready for action. But the night passed without incident, and when the first rays of sunlight broke through the trees, the man finally allowed himself to relax. He glanced at the kittens, who were still sleeping soundly, their tiny bodies nestled together on the blanket. A soft smile tugged at his lips as he watched them, their innocence a stark contrast to the tension that had gripped him all night. "You two don't have a care in the world, do you?" he murmured, his voice filled with affection. Lucky stirred, her tiny paws stretching as she let out a soft chirp. Shadow blinked up at him sleepily, her wide eyes glinting in the morning light. The man chuckled, his heart swelling with love for the tiny creatures who had brought so much joy into his life. "Come on," he said, standing and stretching. "Let's get some breakfast."